there's a lot of uncertainties about climate and understanding the environmental issues. But we only have one planet in which to conduct the experiment. This is something that we need to be very wary of and very careful about. And so I think that in the past, in the 19th century, if we go back to think about the issue of resources and the Industrial Revolution, where probably the Industrial Revolution happened in the UK because you had coal, you had a cheap energy supply. And this is probably why it didn't happen in China in the 1500s. So energy and resources are essential inputs into the economic machine. And I think for a long time, we considered that using up resources was essentially not a constraint. There was plenty of resources out there. In 1800, the population of the planet was about 1 billion people. We're now up to 7 to 8 billion, and we probably will reach 10 billion by mid-century. We also have consumption, which is very different from what it was. And so it's not that, while economics often has stood still in terms of the analytical framework, the demands on resources and energy in our economy has changed dramatically. And so we need to change the way we think about the planet and our economies and the way in which the economy is connected to the natural environment. It's not that the environment has an infinite amount of natural resources to be plundered. That's not a useful way of thinking about it, because a lot of these things are non-renewable. And once they're gone, that's it. So we need to be able to rethink. And the traditional way economists have thought about environmental problems is to essentially think of the environment as an externality, that this is external to the economy. And so if we're serious about the environment, then all we need to do is essentially internalize it and bring it into the understanding of the market. So put a price on it, get the prices right. So how do we do that? Well, you do it through payment for ecosystem services. That if people have to pay for water, they might actually use it more responsibly. We do it through environmental fiscal reform. If you put a tax on pollution, if you make the polluter pay, then they'll probably produce less of it. So you can use markets to help solve some of these discrete environmental problems. And that's been a plank essentially of environmental economics since the 70s and 80s, that we just need to internalize this, put a price on these sort of things, and then let the market self-organize to solve it in a way that generates growth and generates more environmental sustainability. We've also had the logic of what's called the Kuznets curve when it comes to the environment. The idea there is that as economies grow, they will pollute a lot, but then as they develop, they should then start to think about the environment when they're at a later stage of development. So the idea is that you grow dirty and you clean up later. And so that probably worked for certain things like heavy metal pollutant or particulate matter in the atmosphere, that essentially we did institute environmental laws. We did have the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts legislation across the world. And so as we grew, we did start to clean things up. So that logic holds for certain discrete environmental problems. There is an open question about whether that holds for carbon. There we've basically been growing, and carbon has generally been increasing at an even greater rate than growth. So now there's discussion about, well, whether we can decouple. Can growth be decoupled from carbon? But we have so little time to deal with this problem. We have probably 10 years and maybe even less when you look at some of these tipping points. And Johan Rockström, of course, has looked at these ecological limits, and he basically said there were about 7 limits, of which we've already exceeded 3. So we already have done considerable damage. And the problem with tipping points is once we get beyond a certain level, it's not going to be possible to reverse it. So when it comes to the economy, often what policymakers will say is that, yes, we need to grow the economy, we need to create jobs, and environment is not a high priority. But unless we start to deal with the environment, there isn't going to be an economy. So I think we've been poorly served by many aspects of economics. To give you an example, William Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize in economics, and he won the prize for modeling environmental, climate change damage, and macroeconomics, essentially. And among his findings, he said, well, if we have a 6-degree increase in the average mean temperature from industrial levels, 6 degrees, that will reduce global GDP by about 8%. Now, this is lunacy, and this is a Nobel Prize winning idea. The idea, and it goes back to what I was saying about how economists think about the economy. If it's a closed equilibrium system, then it's very insensitive to shocks. So, because you assume that it self-stabilizes and it will self-correct, essentially. So if it gets hit by a shock, it gets knocked off, but then it will converge back. But that means that any shock will have relatively small impacts, largely because of the assumptions we make about the model itself of the economy. So that makes it dangerous. Also the idea that optimization, we should just try to grow as quickly as we can. Well, we should, but if that's destroying natural assets and coming at the expense of the environment, it's a false economy. You might be generating growth, but you're running down the stock of the things that future generations will depend on. So we really need to think intergenerationally about these sort of issues and be very clear about what the science tells us, which is that at 4 degrees, we'd have massive change, disastrous change on our economies. It would have, it would be, essentially, it would change existence on this planet. So it's not a matter of 8% of global GDP. And a lot of these studies that economists have undertaken about the impacts of climate, they've tended to suggest that by 2050, 2060, we're going to have a reduction in global GDP by maybe 3%, 2 to 3%, maybe 4%. And what policymakers today will say is that, well, by 2050, we'll all be a lot richer and technology will be a lot better. So we don't really need to take any action on this. This will be a problem that sorts itself out. And that's why tipping points are so dangerous, because if we leave it too late to take action, it will be too late. So this is a very fundamental issue, and economics needs to be part of the solution and not part of the problem on this one, because there's a lot of denial when it comes to the environmental issue. I think we're getting over the denial that this isn't a real problem. I think more and more that's accepted, that the science is unequivocal. But there's other people who believe in the denial that, well, it's something will turn up. Science will solve this problem for us. But science never cured cancer and has never actually cured the common cold. So to leave the planet in the hands of science alone is a very dodgy proposition. And then the other denial is that, well, it's too late to do anything about it anyway. And that too is we should just try and deal with the contemporary problems and just pretend it's not real. So these are dangerous approaches to this issue. We are not set up to deal with this type of problem, which is very slow moving and with its impact spread over a long period of time, but one in which we'll go right over the cliff and we'll be midair with our legs still moving, but it'll be too late then, and we'll be headed down. So I I think we should be very concerned about this. And we need much better economics to deal with these sort of problems.